This is Nasha Kasha, a Ukrainian almanac. I'm your reporter, Stefan Andrusiak, from Winnipeg, episode 286, in conversation with singer, teacher, producer, and recording artist Alexis Kochan.
I'm Alexis Kochan. I live in Winnipeg. I've spent a lot of my life reflecting on something that I call Ukrainianness, trying to go deeply into the culture and trying to understand it. I'm the child of Mary and Jerry Kochan. So Jerry was Yaroslav Yaropolk, actually. He came from Lviv. And my mom was a Ukrainian Canadian. And her parents were urban pioneers here in Winnipeg in the North End, in Point Douglas, actually. And my father and my mom met in the North End, probably at a dance at Shishkavich Hall or something, which was the place where Ukrainians would meet and make music, the real stuff. We lived in the North End originally and then moved on, stayed in the north part of the city, and those are kind of my roots. My grandparents were also from Ukraine.
The name Kochan, it's quite evocative. It's one who loves.
It's always been Kochan. That's on my father's side, of course, and they came from Sukal, so just outside of Lviv. And I was told the Kochane there were like mafia because they were like 7 brothers. My Didu Volodymyr was a big mover and shaker. He was an activist, was a politician, and sat on the Polish Sejm. Began the credit union movement, was the director of the bank in Lviv. Still a bank today, in fact, the one by the Opera House. Came here and began to run with Tat Kushner, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. So he was the first executive director.
Tell me about your mom.
So my mom comes from a very interesting family as well. Actually, my grandfather was born here, and my grandmother came from Ukraine, again, Western Ukraine. Sort of good peasant stock. My grandmother used to sing really raunchy songs to me when she babysat me. I had 3 amazing grandmothers.
Sing me one of those songs.
Oh, gee, interesting. Okay, so she would sing something like, Катерина Кучерява під рушітком ночувала, під рушітком добре спати, не требася накривати. Чурочками вітер віє, ані змерзне, ані приє. Anyway, that made it into one of my recordings. Катерина Кучерява під рушітком ночувала, Катерина Кучерява під рушітком ночувала, під рушітком добре спати, не требася накривати, під рушітком добре спати, не требася накривати. Чурочками вітер віє, ані змерзне, ані приє. Little Kolomeka. But, that wasn't particularly raunchy, but it had, some subtlety there of raunchiness. My other grandmother was almost like a poet. She, read poetry to me and taught me how to make little dolls with petals. My baba, who stayed in Ukraine, my Didu Kochan's first wife, Alexandra, was a bootlegger. Tough broad. In the 60s, came here to New York to be a nanny for a Ukrainian doctor in New York City. We got to know her at that point. I used to always write to her. It was it's interesting to have amazing grandparents.
You said your parents met at a hall where they played real music. Yeah. Define that for me. So the Shishkavich Hall was quite famous in Point Douglas, and people would come of Jewish and Mennonite Ukrainian background. I've performed at places where, in fact, the Attorney General came up to me at a concert I performed at for Peter Zosky way back for his Literacy Foundation and said, Alexis, when you play your music, it takes me back to Shishkavich Hall. He was a Mennonite Jew.
he grew up in that as well. And it was a culture of everybody coming together Saturday night and cymbal and skripka and so dulcimer and violin and playing the sort of the dances, the rhythms of our people and the melodies. And people would dance and sing, and it was their entertainment. What it was a significant representation of who we were at that time.
Brothers, sisters?
I have a sister. We both kind of took similar paths initially. She's a social worker, and I'm a psychologist. We all stayed in Winnipeg and continued to make it our home.
So music was in your lives already, if not your DNA, but how did you formally acquire your knowledge?
From the time I was little, I heard music. That's sort of the most organic way to become musical, is to hear it, even in the womb. And my mother always sang, and my father always sang, and they have stunning voices. And they sang to me, my Baba sang to me, and that was the beginning of my musical education. I think probably the most important. And then I could, throughout school, and I was always involved in music. I played piano, I studied, the conservatory stuff and took classical lessons, piano lessons. But as soon as I went to university, I was at a high level of playing, but I realized piano wasn't my instrument. What I loved more was voice. But at that time, I was, going to graduate school, and I didn't have time. So once I finished that, I started exploring my voice. And I had an opportunity to go to Ukraine. And that was because I was singing with the Alexis Kochan choir as a chorister. And we were all going to Ukraine in the late 70s, 1978. For me, like on the road to Damascus, I kind of felt like I was in some way where I needed to be. And I began to listen a lot and realized that, I would love to come back here and spend a lot more time. And somehow we managed to do that during the Soviet period, which was no easy task, so that I could work with Anatoly Avdiivsky, who conducted the Veryovka choir. My husband came along. At that time, we were newly married, and so did another young musician, Larry Ivashko, who's an amazing choral conductor and teacher in Ottawa.
Koshitz, was that Walter Klimke who was the conductor? And can you give me a little bit of a sense about him and his, legacy? Yes,
so Walter Klimke was the conductor of that choir, and in many ways a mentor for me. He kind of showed me the sort of deep emotion of Ukrainian music. He was a big fan of my grandfather, Volodymyr Kochan. I think he kind of took me a little bit under his arm and said, your grandfather would be quite amazed that you're walking here on this land in the 70s. My grandfather was gone already. So I wanted to walk every step.
The way you describe it, you have music in your background, you studied piano. What gave you the confidence to leap into it the way you did?
I don't know where confidence comes from. Because all the time you're kind of nervous. You're kind of going, well, is this the right thing to do? I'm stopping my education here. But I really felt in some way that I needed to just grab life at that point in my life and just discover everything I could.
You're newly married. What did the conversation with your husband go like?
It was kind of like, I think we should need to quit our work here now and take a year off. That was it. There was all kinds of things to be done, and Klimke was wonderful enough to be able to handle some of that, to make it happen, because he was very close with Avdiivsky and Veryovka. Otherwise, I don't think that would have happened.
Well, was it a welcoming environment? I take it you traveled to villages and mined authenticity that could be then transcribed in your own particular style.
Yes, it was welcoming to some degree. It was also difficult because, well, first of all, we were kind of ambassadors, so we had to be very, very diplomatic.
Well, give me an example. Could you share?
For example, we lived with like students in, this little residence where there wasn't heat in the winter, so I needed to go to the head honcho, Товариство Україна, who was the poet of Ukraine or something at that time, because this is how these things worked. And
the poet of Ukraine handles your heating system.
Well, he was laughing, but I was saying, you have to come to our place, because I know we're Canadians and we're used to heat, but you other students, everybody here needs heat. So he came and he realized, we need to do something about this. So I guess that's what I mean by diplomacy. We lived like people there. We didn't have a hotel and no one was feeding us.
So did the students and you yourself get extra blankets? Did they do something with the insulation? Did they replace the boiler?
Yeah, I think they were doing all of the above. We did fine in the end. We used lots of layers, like you said, and they were fixing the boiler. Things always took a long time, and that was part of the system. Everything was centralized and it was difficult. Distribution was difficult. We would wait in line like everyone else for toilet paper, simple things. We learned a lot because of that, right? People there, despite that, still had, this essence of something that was strong and definitely Ukrainian. But at that point, it was difficult for them to express that. We heard, of course, in Kiev, where we were stationed, a lot of Russian. When we went to Western Ukraine, we would hear more Ukrainian, like in Lviv. But still, it wasn't acceptable. That part is sad. But we did broke off a little bit, did a couple of things to try to get to a village quietly. And we weren't disturbed too much. But we had sort of our social workers kind of watching us over our shoulders.
So, for instance, in Bukovina, you use a theme or an actual dance as one of the tracks in From Paris to Kyiv. Did you get the notes? Did you record them somehow? How did you transcribe it? Was it all in your head?
Very rarely was I in a village with, a baba and she's singing to me at that time. But I was able to work with some of the young singers who were working with Avdiivsky and Viryovka, and some of the teachers who came from villages and would sing to me. And some of that I did write down. I also was able to get lots of collections. So some fantastic manuscripts, and took home boxes and boxes of things like that I could work through. Not everything that you hear and see is good. And you have to learn also to observe and look around and try to find what is organic and feels indigenous and true. And that's where the difficult work begins.
So you're coming from Canada, from Manitoba, if I can be bold. Who are you to say that something is true? How did you judge that?
I'm no musicologist. I always say I was looking for material from the deepest layer. So I'm looking for that well, and then to dig deeply into it and find what, for example, would be some of the earliest things we would have sung to one another. Ritualistic songs, songs of the seasons, laments. For me, it was pretty clear in my mind what was Ukrainian. But of course, it's a decision I made, and obviously not perfect.
So you came back to Manitoba?
Yeah, so I came back to Winnipeg. I continued with the work I was doing in psychology and decided I'd like to make a recording, for my grandparents and my parents that would be based on these really old ritualistic songs and songs of the seasons. And then decided, I'm going to try to elevate this music to a different place. I thought I would hire a chamber orchestra. So I created a piece called Tsarivna, the princess. It was all about these seasonal songs. I worked with Arthur Paulson from the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra, who was concertmaster. We developed a really interesting little ensemble, and the project turned out great.
It's almost like what Dvorak did for the Slovak people.
Yeah, and Kodai for Hungarians. This idea of, and they've talked about that, the idea of the folk song actually defining a people. And that in some way, if you teach the folk song from littlehood, from kindergarten, that in some way you're defining a nation.
Заспівай нам веснянку, зимували, не співали, весни дожидав. Весна, весна, наша весна, та що ж ти нам принесла, старим бабам букійочку, а дівчатам по віноч. Звідаш я віночок вчора з вечора, зеленого барвіночку, та й повісила на півноч. Матуся вийшла, віночок сняла, та не любо віддав. Коли б вже я теє знала, я б його розірвала, ніж не любо віддав.
And so, yeah, I mean, in some ways it was modernized. There was an orchestra. But because we knew what we were doing, we kept it a little bit like Shushkevich Hall. So you hear, some of the sonorous violin, but then you hear the fiddle. So I would go through scads and scads and scads of material. And in fact, it takes me about 5 years to do each recording. And every recording of the Paris to Kiev project is like an evolution, because the next one is with a slightly different compilation of musicians. Because I'd like to hear, for example, a double bass. So I grab a double bass. And in one of the piece's variances, I wanted to hear percussion in very interesting ways. So I grab some percussionists that are really interesting, indigenous and classical players. That's kind of how the Paris to Kiev project continues.
Can you speak about life in Manitoba today and the music scene? You're a performer, but you're also you're a producer and you're selling a product. So how do you find the audience for that? And does it just swell up around you because it's so beautiful, or did you do some strategic thinking?
As you develop a so-called product, you have to decide how you're going to sell that product. What I decided was that I was going to go full shoes into the music industry itself. I began going to something called MIDEM, which is a conference of music producers in Cannes, France, every year. And there was always a Canadian mission of musicians and producers that would go, and I started going. And here's where I met people who would who would be potential distributors of my work all over the world. This is where I met my distributors. This is where I met people who were in film, would use my music in film. You make all this music, you want it to have voice. I could have gone an academic route and started at a university and continued to do this as well, but I thought I'd have more chance of marketing this well, purely doing it that way, going through the music industry where there's already a lot of people championing Canadian music. And I would be one of those who would be championed, hopefully. And that's kind of what happened. I've had opportunities of all kinds. My music has sold all over the place. CBC, for example, has done tons of airplay for me, always kind of finding a way into it, even though it was in Ukrainian. At one time I was told, don't do this, Alexis. You're not going to be successful. There's no way Ukrainian is going to be accepted in a mainstream way.
Well, what would they offer as an alternative path?
Well, just, sing jazz or something. Do something, because you have a nice voice, so go ahead. That wasn't my point. I have a voice, and I wanted to make it clear that I was singing about a people, that I was singing about a particular people's poetry, and that I wanted other people to have a minute to get deeply into that with me. Because, and this is where the universality comes in, because we're more same than different. And they will find something of themselves there, even if the language is different.
When I was a young man, I found your music really authentic and creatively presented, but so very serious. Even the wedding march, or there was an element, there was a tinge of sadness to it, and maybe it's because I sensed where it came from. And when I re-listened the other night, I heard a lot of joy, because it was always there, and I, the pedantic pedestrian listener, hadn't found it as a young man, but now I have.
Well, thank you. That's a compliment. Because music sometimes has to get into your bones. And takes a while. You know, I didn't begin to love listening to a Beethoven symphony just like that. You're not born with that. It's something you develop, a love you develop. You learn how to listen, right? And then eventually, hopefully, you will hear. I think you're right. The melancholic, for me, it's very present, and I think that's because it's a little bit of our nature, where we definitely have the dance, and we definitely have the joy, but we have also this quiet, subtle, pensive, thoughtful, sometimes intelligent, emotional, and these pieces that go very deeply into your soul.
Обізвався козаченько цаю, обізвався козаченько цаю, а я ж твоє відерце дістану, а я ж твоє відерце дістану. Я з тобою на рушничок стану, я з тобою на рушничок стану.
So I want to ask you, when were the happiest times in your life?
Some of the happiest moments have been when things click, like on a stage, and you've got all your musicians there, and you're doing a piece that's difficult, and it all comes together to the point where you almost feel like you're floating, like there really isn't, a barrier between you and these musicians and the audience. Like everyone is kind of in sync.
Because you're the one who prompted all of that.
Right, that's the ego in me. And you know what? That's true. You have to have some of that. You cannot do good work. I fully believe this. And I say this as someone who studied psychology. You need to have a combination of personality characteristics to do this kind of work. You have to be weak and you have to be strong. You have to be emotional and passionate, and you have to be in balance. These are critical.
As you were answering that question, a siren went by in the distance, and people come to your performances with troubles of their own. And you're good enough to walk on stage and say, I'm going to make you forget about everything except for this moment. And you have that.
Yeah, and I've had the few things that people have said to me that are really nice are, that there's something about the way that you do this. And listen, I am not a perfect singer. There are so many better singers than me, and I've always said this. But I'm a good communicator, and I think that's probably more important. The voice doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, if it's not, it kind of points out how we are imperfect. But if the voice tells a story of a people, that's huge.
Not bad for someone who stood in one of the rows of Walter Klimkew's choir and described herself as a chorister.
Yeah, I know. And I was like 17 when I joined, and I was the young one. And I learned so much.
Talk about your next projects, spoken word, collaborations, anything you want.
I'm releasing a recording in the next little while with a beautiful jazz pianist, Marilyn Lerner. She's well known in the Canadian scene. She's doing some beautiful reflections on some of these old songs. Here, we've also done some work with spoken word, and so I've used some of the fantastic modern poetry by Lesheha, by Ticina from the 20s, and in fact, an old incantation to water at midsummer, which is almost like a prayer, which is very folk.
What is the prayer praying for?
Greetings, dear water, primordial queen, you wash the mountains, the roots, the rocks. Cleanse me from all impurities. Protect me from infirmity. May I be as clean and as sparkling as the spring. Like that.
Those are great thoughts. Щиро вам дякую.
Дуже дякую, Стефан.
All of the music you heard in the program other than the opening theme was provided by Alexis Kochan. Find and buy her music at bandcamp.com. Nasha Kasha is supported in part by the Shevchenko Foundation and the Ukrainian Credit Union. New Pathway Ukrainian News delivers news and insight every week in English and Ukrainian. Subscribe today at newpathway.ca. Back in a week, God willing. До милої зустрічі за тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.